Hey everybody, I'm Jess Fragale, and today we had a great conversation with guest Rosa Lupo. Rosa is a real estate lawyer, and what we talked about was the 5 critical things that you need in a lease that often get overlooked. The reason I thought listeners and viewers would get value out of this is the fact that real estate valuations at the end of the day really come down to the building blocks called leases, whether that is retail, residential, office, or industrial. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Rosa Lupo. Well, first of all, when you analyze or you're working with clients from a leasing perspective, what are those things that you're looking out for, off the hop, and, whether you're representing the tenant or the landlord?
Yeah. The interesting piece about that is that the issues are actually pretty much the top 5 on both sides. It's just that they see it in a very different way. The reality is that the issue itself of what the two sides are facing is the same, and it's the areas that are the highly negotiated areas of a lease in every commercial lease that we do. And the biggest one is always maintenance and repairs. And so when it comes to maintenance and repairs, there's 2 questions you have to ask, and that's the other thing that people forget to ask. It's who's doing it and then who's paying for it, because those are not always the same person. And in a commercial lease, there's all sorts of things to be concerned about. So the landlord wants to make sure that base rent is complete profit, right? That repairs and maintenance, all of it is covered. From the tenant's perspective, they want to make sure that they're not getting charged to make the landlord's building pretty for the next tenant. And there are things that drive that. So in most instances, if the tenant is a smaller tenant of a larger building, then they'll just pay their proportionate share, and they don't really have a lot of concerns. They wouldn't be doing the repairs and the maintenance. It would be the landlord doing it and passing it on. In people call it op costs, operating costs. People call it CAM. It's all the same thing at the end of the day. It's everything that's in addition to base rent. And so if you're a smaller tenant in a larger building, not as much concerned about it, because really what the landlord's doing is maintaining the building in a reasonable manner, and you're going to get your proportionate share. Where it becomes really interesting and contentious is if you're the sole tenant. So if you're the sole tenant in an industrial building, or you're the sole tenant in a distribution center, well, that becomes interesting, because now there's the risk, if you're the tenant, that the landlord doesn't maybe repair and maintain throughout the term, and chooses to do a lot of repairs and maintenance and upgrades at the end of the term if you're not renewing, because they would maybe want a shiny new better building to show to prospective tenants. And if you're not careful in the lease to deal with things like capital costs, then you could be on the hook as the tenant in the last couple of years of your lease with these huge expenditures for repairs and maintenance, and you don't get the benefit of those. And so it's finding that balance where the landlord wants to maintain their building. They don't want the tenant to tell them when to do things because they own it. But the tenant has some risk in that and some skin in the game because they're occupying, and is finding that balance to maintain it in a prudent manner, but not to overly burden the tenant with costs that they don't get the benefits of. And so it is a highly negotiated term.
So on that kind of demarcation between capital expenditures, which would not be downloaded to the tenants, as opposed to costs that would be normal maintenance. So in your additional rent figure. So for instance, a landlord does a new roof, say there's an office building with 3 tenants, it would be that you're saying, depending on how the lease is negotiated, that you want to be careful about if the expectation is that that's going to be downloaded to the tenants proportionately, or if it's going to be something that the landlord is going to take on his or her own.
Right, exactly. And again, it's who does it and then who pays for it. So the landlord's probably going to repair the roof. It's not going to be up to the tenant to do it. But then how are they expensing it, and how are they charging the tenants for it is the question. So if it's just a repair and the roof is exactly the same, that means that it gets expensed in the year in which you incur it, and all of those costs go to that tenant. If they're in the last year of their lease, they're not going to want to pay for a brand new roof that they don't get the benefit of for the rest of the term.
Yeah, I was just laughing there because it just reminded me of first year in accounting where they're like, is it a repair or a replacement? Well, what if it's this piece and then this piece and then this piece? And you
Yeah.
got to kind of take a holistic look at what exactly is being done. Okay, so that would be kind of off the, from the outset, maintenance and repair. That's definitely one we come across all the time. And it is something that the lawyers, like yourself, they go back and forth on.
Yeah.
What would be the next one?
The next one's the assignment of lease. And again, both parties are equally interested in what's happening. So from the landlord's perspective, as you're aware, when you get a tenant, there's a lot of work that the landlord puts into getting this tenant, right? They might have expended costs on leasehold improvements. They might have financed the leasehold improvements for the tenant. They've pre-qualified that tenant and probably reviewed financial statements and historical statements to make sure that they can carry the lease, because they don't want a tenant that can't carry the costs. So they've put a lot of energy and time and costs up front for this particular tenant. So they are very loath to have that tenant then just assign it to somebody else who they don't know. At the same time, from the tenant's perspective, again, it's all a balancing act, but from the tenant's perspective, they're running a business. And if they sell all of their assets, they don't want the landlord to be able to say, no, you can't sell your business. Or if they are a large multinational tenant that has a parent in the US and they have Canadian operations, the US parent's not going to want a local landlord to tell them that they can't do a reorganization within their corporate structure. Or if they are a business and they're selling their shares because they have an exit strategy, so they're going to sell their shares, well, that's a change of control. And that's usually captured in a lease to say you can't do that, again, because the landlord has spent all this time to pre-qualify its tenant. And so it's a balancing act there to kind of reach the right balance where the tenant is not bootstrapped and can do things in their business and not have to be reliant on a landlord, an individual landlord at one particular premise, consenting or not consenting, but at the same time recognizing that the landlord has an interest in who the tenant is and what they're doing and what their finances are. So the tenant cannot have carte blanche either to do whatever it wants.
Yeah.
So
sorry,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, so you gotta meet a middle ground there.
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing we found that was a recurring theme especially over the last 5 to 10 years, is that now that there have been more technology companies, startups in Toronto, a lot of these companies, they don't have a time horizon of 5, 10, 15 years. They're trying to get past the next month. And oftentimes we kept running into the same problem, usually under the transfers section of a lease, saying, well, wait a minute, like our whole goal here is to sell in 5 years. So yeah. This idea of having them, be able to do so. Now, is it correct to say that the quid pro quo for that, or the compromise for that, is potentially staying on covenant, or the landlord being the one to determine at their discretion if the transfer, I think, is acceptable to them as a tenant?
So what we try to do is, rather than giving just a carte blanche like that to say that they have to be satisfied with the transferee, for the landlord to say yay or nay or yes or no or stand in the way of this deal, we try to put some parameters around it if we're acting for a tenant. So what we say up front is, if the purchaser is actually an entity that has at least the same value as the existing tenant. So the landlord has the right to find out how much value and how much equity and what the financial statements look like of the purchaser. But if they are as strong a covenant or greater than the current tenant, you will consent. And so we have that up front, because the other risk from the tenant's perspective, although most landlords are not like this, but if you're in year 3 of a lease and you've negotiated a really good market rent 3 years ago, and rents have gone up extraordinarily and there's high demand, landlords could use the request for a consent as a reason to get out of the lease and relist the property to somebody else. And that could actually scupper the tenant's deal if that's a key location for them. If the purchaser needs that location, that could scupper their deal. So the reality is that the tenant has some skin in the game and doesn't want to lose that. And so that's why we try to get some parameters up front to say, this is reasonable, this isn't. And so you can't say no in these instances.
I remember when I first got into the industry, when somebody explained that portion of, going to the landlord saying we want a sublease or we want to assign, and then they said, okay, you said you wanted to, and then now they have all different rights to, it always reminded me kind of like kids on the playground saying, no, I was joking, don't.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're talking about the provision that actually says if you come to for consent, they can terminate.
Yeah.
And then the tenant gets to say, no, forget it. I don't want the consent. I don't want to assign it. Yeah. And the problem is that if you just asked for a sublease or an assignment because you didn't want to be there anymore, you might have the option to say, forget it. I don't want to assign it. But if you're actually like a tech startup and you're about to sell for $100 million, are you really going to kill your $100 million deal because of one landlord at one location? You're not. Like this, it's not feasible to say, I'll revoke my request, but you could lose those premises for that rent.
No, that makes sense. Okay, so that's assignments. And maybe even before we move to number 3, it's something that comes up, I find, with younger people, especially on the brokerage, and when they get into the industry, there's always confusion as to what we're talking about in assignments and the distinction between that and subleasing or sublets. Could you just touch on, broadly the difference between the two?
Yeah, so a sublet is, I'm company A and I occupy these 1,000 square feet. And now I want actually company B to occupy either a portion or all of the 1,000 square feet instead of me. And that's really a sublet. And the landlord absolutely should have the right to consent to a sublet, because the reality is that they've got new people on the premises. They want to check what kind of business they're running for insurance purposes. Again, they want to know what's happening for rent and to make sure they have enough money to pay the rent. The difference on a sublet is that company B has no direct relationship with the landlord. Their only relationship is with company A, who's the tenant. So company A automatically remains on the covenant, as you said earlier, Jess. They remain on the covenant. They are the ones with the lease with the landlord that have the obligations for the rent. Company B has an obligation to company A only, not to the landlord directly. The difference on an assignment is that company A maybe wants to leave the premises and actually have company B come in and to occupy the whole thing, and they're going to assign the lease. And that actually means that then company B has a direct relationship with the landlord. The other thing that I think most people miss is that in most leases, an assignment, although at law, this is not an assignment, but they include language that says if you change control and you sell your business, so if you sell the shares of company A, we're going to say that's an assignment. And that legally is not an assignment. That's actually just a change of control, and you can do that without assigning.
Yeah.
But most leases by contract scoop that in.
Yeah, that kind of reminds me of, I was just reading a kind of a bankruptcy ruling and talking about how prepaid rent, security deposits and prepaid rent, you have to be very clear which ones are the tenants and which ones are the landlord, where oftentimes, like you said, at law, people write in, no, it was a security deposit. You know how I know? I wrote security deposit. And it's like, well, that's not, you have to be really clear in these things. And it's why we have, people like you actually looking at these documents before we have our clients sign. Okay.
Yeah, well, it is funny because I would say that in most instances, it's funny, leases are probably one of the least reviewed material contracts that a company will enter into. And I think it's because they talk about it in terms of the $12 a square foot. And you're like, well, it's $12, right? But if you actually take the $12, $24, what depending on what you're leasing, but if you actually take that and multiply by the square feet and then multiply by the 5-year term, it's probably the biggest contract the company will ever sign. And they will often not have it reviewed by lawyers because it looks like $12, but it's not.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I've never thought about it that way, because it really is, if you take a look at the consideration, and then if you really start putting in, the likelihood of renewing options, these contracts can get very expensive very quickly, even for small space.
Right. Yeah,
so,
exactly.
So assignment and subleases, maintenance and repairs is number 1, assignments and subleases or assignments number 2. What takes the third spot?
Well, the third one for sure, it's funny because we just talked about that, is damage and destruction. So again, in most contracts, you're not worried about fire and water damage and floods and all of those occurrences. You don't deal with that. But because a lease is A, dealing with physical premises, and B, over a long term, as you say, it's, your typical term's 5 years plus a 5-year renewal. Lots of leases are much longer than that even. So over that time, you got to think things can go bad, right? So something's going to happen. And so the damage and destruction is a key provision. And so from the landlord's perspective, if they have a building that is occupied by many tenants, they do not want you to touch that section as when you come to negotiating the lease, because they don't want to have to rebuild for this tenant, but not rebuild for that tenant. And it has to be the same across the building, because if there's a fire, pretty much everybody in the building is going to be affected in one way or another. Or if there's a flood, pretty much everybody's going to be affected. So they don't want to have different obligations for different tenants. So if you are a small tenant in a larger building, you're pretty much not going to be able to negotiate that section. Then what you do to cover yourself is you go to your insurer and make sure they have business interruption insurance for as long as what's in your lease that says you're going to give the landlord this long to rebuild. Because you won't have those premises, but you will still have the obligation under the lease to continue to pay rent and to go back when it is rebuilt. So you got to make sure that you have insurance coverage for your rental amount.
And
it changes. Oh, sorry.
Just a quick question on that. So would that be kind of the umbrella? Be careful to say the word umbrella regarding insurance, but we, for a long time in Toronto, $2 million liability insurance was our recommendation to tenants. Now I think table stakes are $5 million for the most part. That would cover this type of interruption that you're describing?
Yeah, so business interruption insurance is usually different than your liability, which is what you're talking about, which is like slip and falls or things happening. I think it might be covered under the actual general liability, but it is its own line item. And you have to read the fine lines, because you have to figure out how long are you covered for and how many months of rent in case there is damage.
Got it.
Yeah. And so if you are, though, the sole tenant in a building, in a distribution center again, or in an industrial mall, and you're the sole tenant, well, now you might have some more negotiating power to actually do something that's bespoke between you and the landlord. And in that instance, it's very important for you as tenant that the landlord is obligated to rebuild, especially if this is your sole premises and you can't move to anything else. So you want to make sure that there is very good language for you to say that the landlord will rebuild the building, so you have somewhere to go. You may you'll have to find swing space at some point and find somewhere to be in the meantime. But you want to be able to go back if it's your sole place. And so in that instance, the tenant might have more negotiating ability to actually have a damage and destruction provision that works for them.
Okay. And that is not a bar in Toronto. Swing space is other space you utilize at the time.
Yes. Yeah. It's
yeah.
not a bar. Yes. Yeah,
okay.
Not a place to go to have drinks. Yeah, for sure.
So, okay. So that makes sense. And so what would be next, Rosa? What do we have for number 4?
I think environmental. And I'm clearly, this is not an office building, right? Because that generally doesn't have a lot of risks. But when you start talking about distribution centers, or you start talking about industrial, environmental is a big deal, and it is a heavily negotiated provision. And what the landlord wants from their perspective is they may not be at that building on a daily basis, right? You're running your operations, but they're an owner, so they have some risk vis-a-vis the MOE if there's contamination. So they want to be made whole. They want to know that you as tenant are going to clean up whatever shows up on that property or look after it. The flip side to that from the tenant's perspective is there's all sorts of reasons there can be contamination there, and it may not be at their fault. So there may be pre-existing contamination on the premises. It may have migrated from adjoining lands. And so they want to make sure that they don't have an obligation to actually clean up unless it's something they did against what the rules are and how they've run their business. So if they're doing everything they need to versus the MOE and handling their hazardous materials correctly in accordance with guidelines, they don't want to be on the hook for something that migrated from an adjoining property owner or from something that pre-existed. And the way you get there on the pre-existing is if it's an industrial or a distribution center as a tenant, you should do an environmental test. You should do a phase 1 or phase 2 before you commence. So you have a bright line test of what did pre-exist and what you caused post. Because if it's discovered that there's gas underground, and that's at year 3 of your lease, how do you know from when it was there?
Yeah.
And so you need that bright line test. And then you usually try to carve out anything in the lease that migrates from adjoining lands that you didn't actually cause. If you caused it, you're on the hook and you've got to accept that liability as tenant. And I don't mean you in the instance of just the tenant. It's anybody they're responsible for. They're invitees. If somebody comes on that's delivering stuff and spills, that's still the tenant's fault. So that's okay. What you're trying to alleviate is all these other liability issues.
I would say this is an interesting one in the sense that when I'm typically drafting offers to lease or letters of intent, there's some, clearly there's key points, there's term, there's rent. Environmental is probably the one I find that is not translated from oftentimes not even there in the offer to lease, that is expounded on and debated much more in the lease stage. And that, I mean, part of that is probably the fact that, you know, we're not the subject matter experts on that. But it's a good point because, you know, I'm sure there are certain states have their provisions. I'm not 100% sure on different provinces, but USTs or underground storage tanks, for instance, they're, you know, we have by law, you have to take those out of the ground if you find them. Would this be also an example though, of how business terms can kind of crowd out legal recommendations in the sense that in a hot market, I could only imagine like industrial right now where you have Mr. Landlord is the request of the tenant is to do this phase 1 or phase 2, but he or she has multiple other tenants and maybe doesn't want to go down that kind of rabbit hole, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah, for sure. And it's interesting you say that because I think all of my top 5 are not covered in the offer to lease, right? For sure. And it slows things down when you get to the negotiations. And I think the parties for sure in today's market that's so hot and everybody's moving so fast. And then you start, you know, humming and hawing about who caused the environmental contamination and everybody's annoyed.
Yeah.
And we feel that as the lawyers and all we can do is advise our clients, right? And give them the advice and warn them. My hope is that in year 4, when something happens on the environmental, they hear my words and say, "Oh, she was right." But the likelihood, the reality is that probably in 90% of the instances, there's not going to be any contamination, and it's going to be okay, right? But that's not what we guard against when we negotiate contracts. It's not the 90%; it's the 10.
Yeah, it's those low probability, high impact or high risk aspects. I will say this though, Rosa, I am a good boy most of the time, and at the very least, like assignments and subleases, those are absolutely in our letters of intent or offers to lease at this point, because it is something that materially impacts the deal if they start negotiating after and the two parties had differing views of what they think should be the case. Okay, so that's environmental. So what do we cap off with? I think this is number 5.
Yeah, so I think this one's kind of about vacant space and how it and 2 things that it affects. So when there's vacancies, which there are not a lot of right now. So I'm talking back from my history of my career of when there was vacancies and people used to apply to get real estate tax breaks for vacancies and properties. We don't see that anymore because there aren't any. But for sure, when there's vacancies, there's a couple of things to be careful of. So the landlord, again, wants to be made whole on the building, whether there's vacancies or not. And so when we're talking about proportionate share in a lease, the tenant at the same time doesn't want to suddenly have their proportionate share increased because they've got to pay for vacancies. And so the way that common area costs and operating costs work when you're one tenant with several tenants in a building is that there's this concept of proportionate share, and it's calculated by saying the number of square feet of your space on the numerator and the number of square feet of the total building on the denominator, and that's your percentage of those costs. There is often language that creeps into leases that says if there's a vacancy, every other tenant that is occupying will bump up their proportionate share by a certain amount to cover those vacancies. And tenants don't realize that that's what's in there, and then they're usually surprised during the term. And so it's just being aware of that and knowing what kind of building you're going into. The one that is always gets me though is that I have had some tenants, when I point this out to them and we start talking about it, that then say, but maybe it's a strip mall and it was 6 years ago, and they say, well, but there's 4 stores that are empty there. And it's like, okay, but you're paying that now. So you're paying that from day one. You're paying for those vacant spaces. So that's it. When they go into it with open eyes, they understand them.
It's funny you bring this up. This was probably, when I first started in brokerage, probably one of the most confusing aspects of explaining things to your clients. And it was kind of one of those jokes where we don't tell clients, or we try not to explain rates in terms of net effective rates. And it doesn't really matter for listeners, what you can look that up, what that is, but you get down a rabbit hole of getting into the minutia of the deal. With this one, correct me if I'm wrong, we often see it as gross up, that you gross up the building. And a lot of times in the clause, you'll see, assuming that even if it's 50% vacant, we assume 99% or 95% or 100% occupied. And that was one where, oh man, I needed people like you to kind of walk me through it, because from a just kind of a layperson's perspective, when we have clients, they were, from a fairness point of view, they're like, oh, that doesn't make sense. Why am I paying if it's half full?
Right. But from the landlord's perspective, they want to make sure that the hallways and the reception area and the elevator banks, that all of that maintenance is being paid for, no matter how many tenants are in the building, because even if all the building isn't full, you think your typical office building where you walk into reception, you use the elevator banks, you go up to floor 5, there's 10 floors. Let's say only half of the building, even though you're only using half of the building, you're using all of that area, the half that's there, right? Like that's the flip side to that story. And they have to pay to maintain the lights on, the heat on, fixing the elevators, cleaning it, all of that for that elevator bank, the HVAC that runs the whole building, the reception area. They have to pay for all that. Yeah. So that's the flip side story to that, right?
I used to always use, just because to me, the most non-variable cost was security cameras. So I used to always explain it from that point of view that, whether it's 1 tenant, 10 tenants, 5 tenants, you're going to have the building monitored for security. And just because, a couple tenants leave doesn't mean you shut off half of the cameras. Right. But all those other ones are 100%. That makes sense. Okay, thanks so much for watching. If you'd like to see the full episode, you can head on to Spotify or iTunes, type in Working Capital, the real estate podcast, leave us a 5-star review and write a comment. It really helps us out.